There is a law. It was passed in 1915. It gave Australian government officials the power to remove any Aboriginal child from their family at any time, for any reason. Not suspicion of abuse, not evidence of neglect, any reason. The law did not require a court order. It did not require parental consent. It did not require any justification at all beyond the decision of a government inspector standing at your door. In 1924, an Australian newspaper wrote something that has stayed with me since I first read it. The word stole may sound a bit far-fetched, but by the time we have told the story of the heartbroken Aboriginal mother, we are sure the word will not be considered out of place. That was written in 1924. The policy continued for another 45 years. In 2008, the Australian government issued a formal apology to the stolen generations. Since that apology, the number of Aboriginal children being removed from their families has increased. Here is what no history class will ever tell you. This was not a policy that operated in the shadows. It was not hidden in classified documents. It was not a secret that took decades to uncover. It had a name. It had legislation. It had government inspectors with clipboards and the full authority of the law behind them. And a newspaper called it stealing in 1924, and the government looked that newspaper in the eye and kept going for another 45 years. The same formula repeated across history, but this time the formula had a different target. Not labour, not cost-cutting, not population. This time the target was the culture itself. That is the reason you need to watch this all the way through, because this story does not end with an apology. It ends with a question that nobody in power has answered. If the apology was real, why did the numbers get worse? Every account of the stolen generations begins with the same framing. A misguided but well-intentioned policy. A different era with different values. Something that happened a long time ago and has since been apologized for. That framing is not accurate. Not because the apology was not real, but because the framing asks you to look backward instead of forward. And what is happening forward is the part nobody wants to discuss. But we will get to that. First, the law. In 1869, Victoria became the first Australian colony to establish an Aborigines Protection Board. The board was given extensive control over Aboriginal people, including the right to take children away from their parents. By 1911, every Australian state except Tasmania had laws giving a protection board, or a chief protector, broad powers over Indigenous peoples. Protection. That was the word they used. In 1915, the New South Wales government passed an amendment that removed even the pretense of requiring cause. The Aborigines Protection Board could now assume full control and custody of the child of any Aboriginal person if, after due inquiry, it was satisfied that such a course was in the interest of the child. The interest of the child, as determined by the board, with no appeal. One member of the New South Wales Parliament stood up during the debate on that amendment and objected. His name was Patrick McGarry. He described the policy in language that would not appear in any official government document for another 82 years. He called it stealing the child away from its parents. The amendment passed anyway. When government inspectors arrived at Aboriginal communities, the removals were not always violent. Sometimes they were, but often they were something more calculated than violence. Parents were told their children were being taken for education, for opportunity, for a better life. The institutions the children were taken to had a specific purpose. Not education, erasure. Children's names were changed on arrival. Their Aboriginal names, names that carried family history and cultural identity, were replaced with European names chosen by the institution. They were forbidden from speaking their languages. In some institutions, children who spoke their language were punished. They were taught to reject their heritage, to see their culture as inferior, to aspire to assimilation into white society. Many younger children were not even told they were Aboriginal. Boys were trained for farm labour. Girls were trained for domestic service. Both were prepared for a life at the bottom of the society that had taken them. The Kinchela Boys' Home in New South Wales, the Cootamundra Girls' Training Home, the Bomaderry Aboriginal Children's Home. Institutions spread across the country where Aboriginal children arrived with names and languages and identities and left, if they left, with none of those things. Physical abuse was documented inside those institutions. Sexual abuse was documented. Both were reported. The government continued the policy. Here is the detail that most accounts leave out. The removal policy was not just about labour or cost. It was built on a scientific theory. In the early 1900s, the Australian government genuinely believed that the Aboriginal race was dying out. The policy architects believed that full-blood Aboriginal people would become extinct within a generation, and that mixed-race Aboriginal children, children with both Aboriginal and European ancestry, could be absorbed into white society if removed early enough. The theory had a name: assimilation. But underneath that word was something more specific. The idea that by removing mixed-race children and preventing them from knowing their Aboriginal identity, their children would marry white Australians, and their children's children would marry white Australians, and within 3 or 4 generations, the Aboriginal bloodline would disappear entirely. The government called this process absorption. In 1937, Australia adopted assimilation as a formal national policy. In 1997, the Bringing Them Home Royal Commission report used a different word to describe it: genocide. That word is in an official Australian government commissioned report. This is the part I cannot stop thinking about. In 1924, the Adelaide Sun published an article about the removal of Aboriginal children. The article used a word that no government document had used and no government official had acknowledged. It said the word stole may sound far-fetched, but by the time we have told the story of the heartbroken Aboriginal mother, we are sure the word will not be considered out of place. 1924. A newspaper in Australia used the word stole in 1924. The government read that article. The removals continued for another 45 years. Between 1910 and 1970, between 1 in 10 and 1 in 3 Aboriginal children were removed from their families. The range of that estimate, 1 in 10 to 1 in 3, is itself a document of institutional failure. Because that range exists because the government did not keep consistent records of how many children it removed. They tracked everything else. They tracked the institutions. They tracked the inspectors. They tracked the costs. They did not track the children, with enough consistency to tell you today whether 1 in 10 or 1 in 3 of them were taken. When you do not count something, you do not have to answer for it. In 1995, the Australian Human Rights Commission launched a national inquiry into the removal of Aboriginal children from their families. Over 500 written and oral testimonies were collected from Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, from organisations, from foster parents, from every state in the country. The findings were published in 1997 in a report called Bringing Them Home. The report contained 54 recommendations. The first and most prominent recommendation was a formal national apology from the Australian government. The Prime Minister at the time was John Howard. Howard refused. His reasoning was documented in a public statement that has been quoted many times since. He said Australians of this generation should not be required to accept guilt and blame for past actions and policies. The report sat. State parliaments issued their own apologies. A National Sorry Day was established on May 26, 1998. More than 1 million Australians participated in reconciliation walks. Hundreds of thousands of people signed sorry books, handwritten messages of apology to the stolen generations. The federal government did not apologise. For 11 years. On February 13, 2008, Prime Minister Kevin Rudd stood in the Australian Parliament and delivered the national apology. He said, "We apologise for the laws and policies of successive parliaments and governments that have inflicted profound grief, suffering and loss on these, our fellow Australians." The apology was widely applauded, both inside the Parliament and across the country. Aboriginal Australians gathered in public spaces to watch the broadcast. Many of them wept. The apology did not include compensation. Here is the document that makes this undeniable. Research released in 2019, compiled from data from the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare, examined what had happened to Aboriginal children in out-of-home care between 2008 and 2017. Between 2008 and 2017, the 9 years after the apology, the number of Aboriginal children being removed from their families increased, not decreased, increased. The government apologised for removing Aboriginal children from their families, and then removed more Aboriginal children from their families. The official position is that the intent is different today, that current removals are about child protection, not assimilation. But the Australian Institute of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Studies has documented what happens to the children removed under current policy: the loss of identity, the severing of connection to culture and land, the intergenerational trauma. The effect is the same. A government decides that an Indigenous culture is inferior and must be absorbed. It passes legislation giving its officials the power to remove children with no requirement for cause. It builds institutions designed not to educate, but to erase. It changes the children's names, forbids their languages, teaches them to reject their heritage. When a newspaper calls it stealing in 1924, it ignores the newspaper and continues for another 45 years. When a Royal Commission calls it genocide in 1997, the Prime Minister refuses to apologise and says his generation should not accept blame. When a new Prime Minister finally apologises 11 years later, the removals increase. The Irish famine orphans were moved to serve an economy. The Scottish children were moved to cut a budget. The British children were moved to build a population. The Aboriginal children were moved to end a culture. Same removal. Different purpose. Deeper damage. Because you can reunite a family separated by an ocean, you cannot reunite a child with a language that was beaten out of them before they were old enough to remember it. There is a law. It was passed in 1915. It gave Australian government officials the power to remove any Aboriginal child from their family, at any time, for any reason. In 1924, a newspaper called it stealing. In 1997, a royal commission called it genocide. In 2008, the government apologised. And the numbers got worse. Every source cited in this video is publicly available. The 1915 Aborigines Protection Amending Act is in the New South Wales Parliamentary Record. The 1924 Adelaide Sun article is in the National Library of Australia's Trove Archive. The 1997 Bringing Them Home report is published by the Australian Human Rights Commission. The 2008 Kevin Rudd apology is in the Australian Parliamentary Record dated February 13, 2008. The 2019 research data is published by the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare. The law has changed. The language has changed. The numbers have not. And somewhere in Australia right now, there is an Aboriginal child being removed from their family under a policy that calls itself protection. The same word they used in 1869. If you've been watching this channel and something in this video made you uncomfortable, that discomfort is the point. Subscribe, because the stories that make us uncomfortable are exactly the ones we need to keep telling.